As someone who's been here at Chicago with you for a long time, I kind of know pretty much what you do. At least the way I think about it, you've kind of spanned three broad areas, and maybe there's more. I think at a general level, kind of macroeconomics, finance, and kind of, let's call it empirical methods or econometrics, and I don't think in the way you've approached it, you think of those as three separate things, but really three sets of areas that work pretty well together, and you've been able to work in all of them. You want to talk a little bit about how you see your career? And I should note you won a Nobel Prize for it, so it's a very impressive career in and of itself. But kind of how you think about the body of work you've done over several decades now.
Yeah, there's kind of been a very interesting evolution to it. So I kind of start out with a very strong background in kind of economic dynamics coming out of graduate school, coming out of Minnesota. Minnesota was kind of at very early stages of how to integrate in kind of economic dynamics with kind of economic fundamentals at the same time. In many respects, Chicago-type fundamentals, kind of grounded in microeconomic reasoning, but really pushed towards broad-based questions, macroeconomic type questions and the like. So I had a very strong training there coming out of Minnesota. I felt I was kind of privileged to have that, but and also a pretty good training in terms of econometrics as well, I suppose, time series econometrics. So those two pieces started being put together there all the way from graduate school. It's true that I came out of that with kind of thinking about the connections between the two. Economic dynamics are interesting to me in part because of their observable implications and the like.
But doesn't that also tie into your subject areas? I mean, you've been interested in macroeconomics, which obviously is critically related to the idea of dynamics, that how the economy evolves over time through investment and other decisions that people make. In finance, which is about how asset prices, for people, stocks, bonds, all the assets, houses, anything else you want to think of. So it seems to me they all fit together. They're all tied together.
Yeah. So my connections to finance came out from a kind of a macroeconomics background to begin with. And so it's less about how to design kind of portfolio management challenges and more about how to think about connections between the macroeconomy and financial markets. Financial markets, at the very least, were kind of a barometer because it involved forward-looking investors and them thinking about longer-term macro consequences, and then more generally the interplay between the two. So that became kind of my substantive area of largest focus, and I was kind of felt very lucky to collaborate with some people that were able to make some headway on it. The interesting thing evolved in my career, though, so that early on, a lot of my econometric type work was supposed to be about estimating models, and it turned out to be more about characterizing limits of models, so-called puzzles. Empirical puzzles they're only puzzles relative to a class of models, and this kind of interplay between data and models, where are the models deficient and how can we think about them going forward, and that led to my really thinking even harder about statistical issues from the standpoint of, in a very complex environment where people are having to make guesses about the future, how does the environmental complexity affect the way they make those guesses? Forward-looking decisions like investment. How much do I want to invest in some project? How do I want to allocate my portfolio? How much schooling I want to undertake? Those are all very forward-looking decisions, and they involve guesses about the future. And how do we think about environmental complexity? And statistical tools kind of give a useful way to think about that, to kind of push beyond this notion that somehow investors have everything figured out, which is a nice simplification to start off with, the ones in which they're also making struggles in some sense, roughly analogous, say, to some of the struggles I was facing as an econometrician trying to sort things out.
Well, let me try to unpack a little bit what you've been talking about, because I think it's going to help us understand some of the real implications of your research and also how you got to where you are. In some sense, the forecasting element of Lars, everything you've told me so far kind of leads, I think, directly into many of the things that you think are critical for people to understand today. So first one was this sort of two-way street between finance and macroeconomics, that financial variables can be used as a barometer of what's going on. They tell us a lot about what's going on today in the economy and what people think is going to happen in the future.
Yeah,
so are people optimistic about the future? Are they thinking that, well, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future? Financial variables can tell us a lot about that.
Yes.
Over time, things have morphed, I think, in your career, but also the thinking in economics has morphed to bring in more the second channel as well, which is that financial sector has an impact on the macroeconomy.
Right.
It's not
Absolutely.
just a window into what's happening.
Yes.
It's part of the process for what's happening,
Yep.
which again, I think ties back into your third point, which is all these, because they're so forward-looking, what you called before economic dynamics.
Yeah.
And really, I think people should understand that, most sciences have an element of dynamics, whether it's physics, talking about how planets move around the sun.
Yes.
The interesting part that comes in economic dynamics is the forward-looking part.
Yes,
the
absolutely.
planets aren't looking where they're going,
Yes,
right? They
right.
don't sit there and say, oh boy, if I go this way, I'm going to run
Right.
into something else.
Absolutely.
They're dynamics, but backward-looking dynamics.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
And so one of the things I think you've stressed is the critical element of the forward-looking
Right.
dynamics, people thinking about the future.
Yes.
And of course, the critical thing about the future is, unlike the past, which we potentially could know
Yeah.
to some limits,
Yeah.
the future is inherently uncertain.
Yes.
And so uncertainty comes in as well.
Absolutely.
So you want to talk a little bit about, first, on the barometer side.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the key insights you got about how we can use financial models to kind of, as a barometer of
Yeah.
of the economy, and how that's influenced practical problems, for example?
Yeah, it's kind of led me to think more broadly about decision making under uncertainty. So in economics, we often use and teach this model of what we call risk aversion. And risk aversion is a situation in which we imagine the people who are modeling know all the probabilities of everything, but they just don't know outcomes. It's just the outcomes they don't know, but the probabilities they have figured out. And then the fact they don't know the outcomes, but they can assign probabilities to them, leads to these kind of models of risk aversion. Yeah, and people might be cautious because they don't know outcomes.
They know it's 50% chance things are going to be good, 50% chance things are going to be bad, but they don't know which one's going to happen.
Precisely.
That's the classic view of uncertainty.
Precisely. It's like rolling dice. It's like flipping coins. We're very confident in the probabilities. It's just the outcomes we don't know.
Okay.
And to situations in which statistics has long wrestled with the fact that we don't know probabilities, but we have to use evidence to figure out probabilities. Now, to use evidence to figure out probabilities kind of requires some type of model for how we think about forming those probabilities. And so that's one stage, somewhat more complex that already statistics has wrestled with. The very elegant theory of Savage, who was here at the University of Chicago for subjective probability, building on the insights of Di-Finetti and the like, was kind of trying to address issues like that.
Where we don't know the probabilities, but we're trying to learn the probabilities.
Learn from data. We try to learn them from data. And so that's a long-standing kind of statistical problem, but it's also a problem people face in their own decision-making.